Ahoy! Hashtag Zach here. Today we're going to talk a lot about cause and effect and look at the forces that drove to the start of the Cold War. So first, let's get some facts straight. Who's involved? When is this going on? What's kind of the situation at the time? Well, to do this, we have to go back to the end of World War II. It is January of 1945. The Axis are retreating on all fronts. The British from the north, the Soviet Union from the east, and the United States from the west are all closing in on Berlin, the heart of the Nazi German war effort. Most world leaders know that the war is finished. Germany has nowhere near the manpower, resources, or industry to continue fighting for even a year. However, World War II is a total war where all of the citizens, industry, economics of every major power are full thrown into the war effort, nothing held back, and no surrender. Germany will keep fighting until every last square inch of their territory has been taken or the entire military is completely demobilized. Knowing that the rest of Europe is completely devastated, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union decide to send their leaders to a one conference where they can decide what the fate of Europe will look like after the war. The Soviet Union sent Joseph Stalin, the man on the left. He was a ruthless, genocidal dictator responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of people. However, he had established the Soviet Union during the Russian Revolution, and he was a brilliant politician. The man in the center, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was the United States president and had been since 1933. He had led the country through the Great Depression and organized the war effort. He had the full support of the American democracy. The man on the right was Winston Churchill, an aristocrat from Great Britain who had been involved in government all his life, but had finally been elected to the point of prime minister when Hitler had launched World War II and the previous prime minister resigned. The meeting was set to take place in Yalta in February of 1945. This is a city in the region of Crimea in southern Ukraine, currently occupied by Russia today. There have been entire books, and even entire book series, written about each of the men involved in this conference and the people that they took with them. There's so much history and biographical information that goes into this, with their strengths and weaknesses in negotiation, about their accomplishments in life before this, and what their goals were and strategies were going into the conference. However, I'm going to skip over a lot of this and only cover what's the most essential to know to understand the Cold War, which is how this really set the stage for the Cold War. Because without some of the decisions made in this conference, the Cold War might really not have happened. So, what did they decide? Their focus was on laying the groundwork for how Europe would be organized in the aftermath of the destruction of the German Nazi regime that had been ruling Europe for the past several years. They decided that the best way to organize this would be to divide Europe into occupation zones, where different countries between the Soviet Union, Britain, and the US would be in charge of organizing different areas, making sure the governments got reinstalled, that the economies were running again, and that the people were safe while there wasn't a government of their own to protect them. However, this had the result of creating different zones that partially stood in opposition to each other. And when the Soviet Union began setting up communist tyrannies that were answerable only to Russia, the democracies of the United States and Great Britain stood against this. And in the end, there was a line formed between East and West, between Soviet communist and democratic capitalist. That's a lot of ideologies that I just listed off right there, because that's another huge thing that led to the Cold War: ideological confrontation. So this means that basically different groups of people have different ideas of how government and economics should work, different ways of life, and these disagreements lead to international tensions. The Western world, the sphere of influence that the United States and Britain had, was very reliant on democracy and capitalism, a system where people have a lot of control over how the government operates and what they're able to do with their own private property. The East was run by totalitarianism and communism, which is basically where the government has total control over not only how it runs itself, but how people run their own lives. And not only that, but also how they run their property, where in a lot of situations, there is no such thing as private property. It's all run by the government. These two sides each have their own arguments, and there have been many debates throughout history over which side is the correct one. However, as it stood at this time, the East was cracking down on the people of Eastern Europe through totalitarianism and dictatorship, and in some cases even atrocities and genocide, doing horrible things to its own people and the people around them, while the West was standing up mainly against this as a reaction. This is really the tone that was set at the start of the Cold War. And now the stage was set for a struggle that would encompass the whole world, the Cold War. However, a thing that's hard to understand is, how did it actually become triggered, and how was it fought? World War II started with the invasion of Poland, and was fought over many invasions in Russia, in France, and in North Africa and the Mediterranean. How exactly was the Cold War fought, and what started it? The specific event that most historians attribute to the actual first real confrontation of the Cold War was what many call the Berlin airlift. In the middle of East Germany was Berlin, the former capital of the Third Reich of Nazi Germany. This was divided into multiple zones itself because it was seen as too important to be left just to the Soviets, where not only the Soviets, but also the United States, France, and Britain each had a piece of the former capital. However, by 1949, all of the Western pieces had been consolidated by Britain, France, and the United States into one city of West Berlin. As opposed to the Yalta Conference, or the division of Europe into zones of occupation, this is the first real confrontation of the Cold War, because this is the first time where the two sides were working in active opposition to each other, and there was a real threat of military violence. In June of 1948, 3 years after World War II ended, the Soviets blockaded off West Berlin from Western Europe. This was because they were very wealthy. They were growing prosperous from American investment and trade from Western Europe. Meanwhile, the Soviets and their prisoners in Eastern Europe were struggling and languishing under communism. This led many to flee in droves to the West, and especially West Berlin, as it was right in the middle of Soviet territory. The Soviets couldn't stand for this, as it would lead to a collapse in their system possibly in years to come. So they closed off West Berlin from the rest of the world so that they could starve it into submission and make a symbol to the rest of the world that communism was not to be messed with. However, in a stunning act of resolve, the U.S. president at the time, Harry Truman, organized the Berlin airlift. They would use the wealth and technology of the West to send supplies by air into Berlin and prevent it from collapsing due to shortages of food, fuel, or trade. This kept the city supplied for nearly a whole year, and eventually the Soviets saw the pointlessness of their actions and how evil it made them look in the eyes of the rest of the world, so they relented and ended the blockade. So there you have it, A world divided between East and West, between communism and totalitarianism on one side, and democracy and capitalism on the other, with one side aggressively expanding and subjugating people, and the other standing up in resistance and defiance to try to stop this from happening, but prevent another world war by doing this through peaceful means, or indirect means. This would set the tone for the Cold War, and the first confrontation had happened. I hope you learned something new in this video. Please comment, like, subscribe, and stay tuned. See you next time.